Egypt. The uprising led to a negative economic shock in Egypt. The GDP growth dropped from 5.1% in 2010 to 1.8% in 2011. Tourism, exports, and investment declined. Due to a lack of tourism revenue and many businesses closing, Egypt borrowed money externally and internally, which pushed the external debt to 60 billion. Unemployment has also risen and is high among young people with college degrees. And lastly, inflation increased. These are some graphs showing the economic damage. You can see that GDP growth takes a huge drop in 2011. The external, and then on the right on the graph, you can see the external debt just gradually increasing over the past decade. For the Egypt's political impact, President Hosni Mubarak, who was in office for 30 years, was pressured to resign on February 11, 2011, and later faced trial for complicity in the murder of protesters. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces dissolved the Parliament of Egypt, suspended the constitution, and dissolved the nation's emergency laws after a 31-year state of emergency. In 2012, a democratic election took place and Mohamed Morsi was elected for president. Next, please. These are just photos showing the protesters in Egypt, the protesters' frustration with the president and his regime. So for social impact in Egypt, women were actively involved in the protests, with many hoping that a regime change would bring more attention to issues of gender injustice in Egypt. However, women's rights still remain an issue in Egypt. Egypt's infrastructure, housing, and social services have not kept pace with the rapid rise in population, so poverty increased, especially after President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's administration cut the subsidies for food and fuel that many Egyptians depend on. In that photo, you could see the women protesting. I think that was the last slide. Oh, this is a photo of just the poverty that's going on in Egypt. And that's that, and thank you.
Okay, very good. Now pass to the second group. Who's going to be doing the presentation in this third group? We have Rachel Garner, Jessela Martinez, Jessica Juarez. Which one of you is going to be doing the presentation?
I'll be sharing my screen, sir. It's Rachel.
Okay, Rachel, can you pass it on to Rachel?
Yeah, I'll do that right now.
Okay.
I just did it.
Okay. Awesome, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Our group is presenting on the Arab Spring for the country of Tunisia. My name is Rachel. And my group members are Giselle and Jessica. Let's get started. So just a little background on what the Arab Spring is. So for many years, Arab countries have been governed by dictators who restricted their political freedom, controlled economic resources, and ignored many social problems. Mostly the youth, but many citizens were very unhappy with how these governments were being ran, and it led to public demonstrations and protests against the autocratic regimes. Mohamed Bouazizi was a Tunisian street vendor who set himself on fire on December 17, 2010, after an officer took away his cart and local officials refused to hear his complaints. This became a catalyst for the Tunisian revolution, and many countries followed suit, such as Yemen, Egypt, Syria, and Libya. A little bit of background on who their previous president was. His name was Ben Ali, and he was the president of Tunisia prior to the Arab Spring. Ben Ali was trained at a military school in France and studied engineering in the United States. Between 1964 to 1974, he was head of the Tunisian military security. He was known for suppressing riots and specifically the Islamic tendency movement. This movement focused on creating a multi-party democracy and a fair distribution of economic resources. At the beginning of his term, he received 99% of votes, as many believed he would be more moderate toward religious fundamentalists, until he banned the Ennahda group, or the Renaissance Party. This tarnished his reputation, and he began to see criticism for his human rights policies. During the Arab Spring, Ben Ali was forced out of office by protesters. Even though he had talked about, I'll just finish 6 more months, they completely stopped his presidency, and then he was forced out of the country. Later in 2010, Ben Ali was convicted of embezzling public funds, smuggling drugs and weapons, and for killing protesters in Tunisia. He was given a life sentence. So after Ben Ali was removed from office, the Tunisian democratic transition brought many positive changes, one being a multi-party tradition. By having a multi-party tradition, no one group holds a majority of winning seats. So this requires the different groups to negotiate and compromise in order to move forward with government policies. The most tension has been seen between secularists and Islamic radical groups as Tunisia is building their government policies. The Islamic Salafist radical group wants Islam to be incorporated into economic, political, and judicial practices. This would be a complete merge between religion and state, while secular groups such as Ennahda want different things. They have emerged as a top political party and want a democratic state where people can make their own decisions on how they want to live. So despite the tension between these groups, Tunisia was able to create a constitution. Tunisia is a republic with Arabic as its language and Islam as the national religion. Citizens have the right to practice any religion and form political parties, which is huge because preventing any one group from having complete control allows a democracy to flourish. They created a singular chamber, the Assembly of the People's Representatives, and the Constitution includes procedures for electing a president and how long each elected member may serve. These are all very positive changes, but really in the long term, seeing them continue to practice these different ideas will be the deciding factor on whether this political structure will continue.
The effects of the Arab Spring had on Tunisia's economy. So before the Arab Spring, the country was already facing economic instability. For example, the country was already experiencing high prices, high unemployment, and many people were living in poverty. However, after the Arab Spring, Tunisia was left in deplorable economic situations. So according to the report, Rethinking the Arab Spring, the cost of the upspring in Tunisia estimated at $2.03 billion, which accounts for 5.22% of GDP. So the impact of the riots on several economic indicators, such as the inflation rate, government spending, unemployment rate, and general debt and investment, worsened Tunisia's economy. Next slide, please. Looking at the economic indicators at a closer perspective, the impact on unemployment in Tunisia was 13% of people who were in the labor force are currently unemployed. A large percentage of the unemployed are young. On that note, the youth employment rate exceeds 26%. The unemployment rate among recent graduates is also growing. This leads to a huge distribution of wealth being uneven between rich cities and poor rural areas, which this also makes the distribution of job opportunities unbalanced. The inflation rate on Tunisia has increased over the years. In 2009, the inflation rate was 3.7%, and in 2011, the inflation rate increased, reaching 5%. Next slide, please. So lastly, the government spending and general debt and investment in Tunisia. For government spending and general debt in the country, as a consequence of the protests, government expenditures increased and altered the fiscal balance by $489 billion. For investment, the IMF states investment on GDP decreased from 26.4% to 25.3%, most likely because interest rates went up and it made it more difficult for private sectors to expand their businesses and hire people.
So as we had mentioned with economical and political chaos, tennis also struggled with the social construct, so dealing between the state and its citizens. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was state-led development, including industrial development, jobs, health, and education that were attempted. However, due to the deteriorating economy performance, it did lead to the collapse of all the social construct attempted and failed to provide these services to its citizens. An unsocial construct emerged using trade, industrial, and economic policies to favor emerging capitalist groups instead of its citizens. So then this led to growing inequality, diminishing benefits for masses, resulting in the Arab Spring. So it's just kind of a combination of everything going on that really led to an unsocial construct, as mentioned before. That's kind of all we have right now, information that we gathered. I don't know if there's any questions that want to be asked.
That's pretty good. Thank you. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Anyone has questions for Jessica on her group?
Professor, I have a question for you. Are you recording this?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's recording.
Okay, well, if you don't have any questions, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Okay, the next group is group 4, Ali Hamza, Sam Park, and Joshua Levy. So who's
so
going
I'm going to be sharing the screen.
So who's gonna, yeah.
Ali.
Ali, okay, so why don't you pass it on to Ali and let him take care of the share screen.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Can everybody see my screen so far?
Yep.
Oops.
Yeah,
you're good, Ali.
Yeah, I can see it.
Oops, wrong thing.
By the way, Ali, do you speak Arabic?
I do, I sure do.
Oh, that's good. All right.
My father's from Syria and Damascus, and my mom is from Jordan, so I get a little bit of, mix of cultures.
Oh, good. Syria and Jordan, that's a good combination.
Yeah, it sure is.
All right.
So I'm gonna start my presentation now. So today we're gonna be talking about the Arab Spring, specifically in Yemen. We have the background showing how Yemen is actually doing today and during the Arab Spring. So it's a little bit disrupted if you guys haven't heard from the news. My colleagues are going to be Sam Park and Joshua Levey, and we're each going to be discussing different aspects of the Arab Spring. So they're going to have a chance to share what they did the research on. So I'm going to be discussing specifically the politics and a little bit about the background and history of Yemen. So before the 1967, the British had actually colonized Yemen, and they divided it into two pieces. So there was Southern Yemen and Western Yemen. And in the 1990, they united, and they made what's today called the Republic of Yemen. Mohammed Saleh, who was formerly the president of North Yemen, was elected as president of the new Yemen, and his leadership was under authoritarian rule, meaning that the government was kind of strict and they had a lot of power. In 2011, protests began in Yemen. So I know a lot of people did the background of what the Arab Spring is, so I'm not gonna bore you with that. And here's a picture of Mohammed Saleh, a little bit, of their logo. And I included a fun fact. He was actually friends with Saddam Hussein, but after 9/11, it led him to support the United States in exchange for money. So in a sense, that kind of shows you where the money was, Mohammed Saleh was. What led protests in Yemen? So that's the main question. There we go. So the protests. High unemployment. So for most MENA region, unemployment was really high, but specifically in Yemen, it reached up to 35%, and the standard of living really got bad. And corruption. So corruption, people basically had no rights. the government could go, they did have some rights, but the government had more rights and they could come in and take in any property, anything they wanted. So they weren't really that protected. And the government attempted to change the constitution. So if you know anything about Muslims, you know that they care so much about the Sharia law. And the Yemen was actually ran by the Sharia law mostly. And Muhammad Saleh wanted to change it into a parliamentary system. He also increased the government wages while the people were hungry and starving and didn't have jobs. So that kind of pissed them off even more. And the economic condition, which my colleague Joshua will be discussing in a few moments. So the resignation of Saleh. So he actually resigned in 2011, but before that, the protests launched a missile at his palace. So that's kind of interesting. He didn't die in it. He was just injured and he had severe burns on his hands where he was treated in Saudi Arabia. Saleh assured Yemen that he and his son were no longer going to rule. And that's mostly because of the safety. People were getting really violent. So later on, he ended up actually getting killed in 2011 by the Houthis who chased him while he was trying to escape Yemen. And he was actually sniped. So if you want, I didn't really want to include the picture of him, dead. So I just included a sniper. And his leadership was actually passed down to Vice President Hadi, who just happens to be the president today. And I personally think he's not doing as a good job because, if you heard anything about Yemen, you'll know that the country is actually going to be one of the poorest ones in the world. And the economic conditions will later now be discussed with Joshua.
Okay.
Thank you, Ali. So before we actually begin, let's talk about Yemen's economy today, actually, and I think as of 2019. So as of 2019, Yemen is actually one of the poorest countries within the Arab world, being heavily dependent upon its oil reserves. Petroleum accounts for roughly 25% of its GDP, while the rest of it is actually made up by government revenues. The unemployment today is 12.9%, but the inflation is actually 41.8%, making it one of the highest in the region. And their overall GDP for today, 2019, is 73.3 billion, and their average annual growth, which is compounded 5 years, is actually negative. So it's shrinking. So how did the Arab Spring impact the overall economy of Yemen? So the spring actually has completely exacerbated the overall economy since its start in 2011. Unemployment has been rising, with the most recent estimates to be at about 35%, according in 2012. This in turn results in a loss of income and therefore a decline in standards of living, more accurately reflected in the GDP per capita, which was estimated in 2011 to be $2,500. And as of today, it's decreased to $2,377 according to the heritage.org. And the population that is actually below the poverty line, so that actually live below poverty, is almost half, 45.2%. And this is the slide that shows once the Arab Spring actually took into effect, the production costs had actually completely decreased and the consumption had almost basically flatlined. Arab Spring continued. So Yemen, already being a suffering country, is experiencing a loss of national output as well, since people are spending most of their time on this protest rather than working, resulting in resources being wasted while decreasing their overall GDP. And this chain reaction ensures causing more workers to be laid off, in addition to the decrease in wages, implies a decreasing money multiplier. So if people do not have the money to save and invest, banks can't create more money by distributing loans. So originally this whole kind of initiative was to create social change, and in reality, the overall larger scale on their overall impact of Yemen greatly affected their economy as well as their macro economy. And can you do the next slide? So what were the overall results of the Arab Spring? So the overall results were Yemen experienced surging inflation rates since the Arab Spring, ranking as one of the highest rates in the world, now at 20% in 2012. And as I showed you guys earlier, the inflation rate today is actually double that. And before this had even occurred, it was sitting at 11.2%. So the overall impact has negatively affected Yemen's already poor economy, and the adverse effects are intertwined, leading the country further into poverty. As for the social impacts, those will be talked about by my classmate, Sam.
Thanks, Joshua. We'll go over the few social impacts that Yemen experienced during the time. And so the social uprisings Yemen experienced followed the Tunisian and Egyptian revolution. Although the reasons of why people protested throughout the Arab Springs were similar, in the MENA region, Yemen in particular, citizens were very concerned with the poor economy as well as the increasing unemployment rate. Additionally, there were many citizens who did not support President Ali Abdullah Saleh and decided a change in government. Although the protests accomplished some political awareness and changes, it did not have long-term benefits changes on a social scale. Much of Yemen's population at this time lives below the poverty line and continues to do so even after the uprising. We will speak more about this on a later slide, but much of the poverty issues come from an unhealthy mix of rapid growth in population and an uneducated population. Next slide, please. Poverty is a recurring theme in many of the nations that belong to the MENA region, and in Yemen, it's a huge problem. Poverty rate from 1990 to 2000 was 29%, and the poverty rate from 2000 to 2009 was 46.7%, and it continues to rise even after the uprising. To go a little deeper, what this means is that almost half of the population during that time was living off of $2 or less daily. In general, poverty was mostly concentrated in rural areas and affected the uneducated, as well as those who were living in unfavorable social circumstances, such as widows. When much of the population is in poverty, their access to social services such as education, healthcare, and even food becomes limited. Next slide, please. And then we'll talk a little bit how poverty often leads to inequalities. In Yemen, alongside Syria and Egypt, are nations that face some of the highest inequality. It certainly doesn't help that Yemen is among the poorest nations in the MENA region. And so the problem when a country experiences a quick population growth is that it's hard to make the proper social investment needed to prevent or limit poverty. And according to a UNICEF report in 2014, the amount of girls in Yemen was not in school was nearly half. 2 out of 3 girls are reported to be illiterate, and the percentage of adult illiteracy in 2010 is only 36.1%. And one reason to explain this is that social norms such as religious or tribal values deters females from pursuing education. Next page, please. Another aspect of inequality we would like to touch on is the topic of healthcare. According to a report by the World Bank, 6 women die every day from pregnancy-related complications. This has to do with the fact that much of the population in rural areas has little access to healthcare clinics. And this was especially devastating in 2016 when there was a cholera outbreak. That's a problem even until this very day. And so that also leads to malnutrition. 58% of children face the problem of growth studs due to malnutrition, and 43% of the population is underweight. 91% of the water usage was devoted to agriculture, whereas the other remaining 8% was split between domestic and internal industrial use. And much of Yemen's population today suffer from inadequate food supply. All of these different social factors influence the frustrations that motivated the uprising. And then next page.
So here's our citation. We include all our citations, and before we leave, we like to leave with a little bit, style. So here's our style, dropping the mic. So Obama, we got Obama in the back.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, Ollie, could you send the host to me, Michael Hubbub?
Michael. Hey, how do I do that though?
You just go to my name on the participation chat.
Participation.
You could find it by typing in Michael.
Got you, Michael Hubbub.
Michael Habhab.
Co-host?
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, good. Just before we go to Michael Habhab, as far as Yemen is concerned, it's one thing to note about the Yemen, basically. I mean, to add insult to injury, basically. I mean, you know how poor Yemen is, and you know how much these people have suffered. What has happened to Yemen on top of all of that is for Saudi Arabia to wage war on Yemen. This is something that's really you know, it upsets me, of course, as a human being, to see a country like Saudi Arabia, who's rich in resources and has really nothing to worry about, to actually wage war on Yemen, poor Yemen. For what? I don't understand. So this is simply to basically add insult to injury. And as a result, Yemen is pretty much suffering from this war. It has completely devastated the infrastructure of Yemen, and it has turned a lot of people, you know, they're already below the poverty line, but pretty much if they were 60% below the poverty line now, probably, you know, you're talking about 90% of the people below the poverty line. So, you know, that just one comment I thought is important for all of you to know what's going on in the MENA region. Wars never solve anything. Wars make matters worse. They really don't make them better. But unfortunately, people don't learn, and they will keep on waging wars against each other, which it leads to nothing but destruction, killing, and that's what we see in the MENA region, unfortunately. Okay, go ahead, Mark.
Hello, everybody. Me and my partner Joseph's presentation is on the World Governance Indicator on Qatar. The World Governance Indicator is divided into 6 categories: control of corruption, regulatory quality, political stability and absence of violence, rule of law.
Can we see those things? Do you have them on?
No, this is just the beginning intro.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
Rule of law, government effectiveness, and voice and accountability.
All right, so the first indicator that we're going to be looking at is the control of corruption in Qatar. And on the right, we see a nice graph of the estimates over the last 10 years. This is mostly on how it changes from year to year, not the percentile rank. We see at the very bottom of the slide, Qatar is in the 77th percentile of this indicator. It's actually the second best performer in the MENA region. It used to be the best performer until very recently when the United Arab Emirates kind of moved its way in. So with this, it's a little bit iffy on the legitimacy of its placing because it has a different definition of corruption. But the control of corruption is supposed to capture the perceptions of the extent which the public power and the government is able to extract for private gain. Can we go to the next slide? So yeah, the way that they define corruption is mostly through bribes, but there's another system in place called the wasta, which is just your social connections, and it's who you know in government that will give you a favorable deal, financing, land. It can take many different forms. In fact, a 2010 World Value Survey for Qatar reveals that 29% of Qataris attribute success to luck and wasta only, and a further 15% attributing it mostly. So it plays a very big part in the Qatari economy, too much for a lot of people to be comfortable with. In the term of bribery, civil servants normally do not take bribes because they are paid so well by the government for not too terribly intense of a job. So there's not that much incentive to take the bribes. And foreign public employees don't take bribes for fear of deportation if they're ever caught. So for the wasta type of quote unquote corruption, there have been many UN measures and many international measures trying to curb the prevalence of it, as well as the political concentration and the corruption that can be fostered in that system. There was the UN Convention Against Corruption, which was ratified in 2007, but its measures haven't really fully been enacted and implemented. There have been many institutions that have tried to get that going over the years, but it hasn't really fully taken effect. Next slide. Here we're going to regulatory quality, and this kind of measures the private sector more than the public sector, but the public sector takes up a large portion of the economy of Qatar, so there isn't a lot left over for private all the time, and those that are left over for private is affected by the WASTA system still. We find that Qatar is in the 70.70th percentile, plus or minus 5 historically. It hasn't trended one way up or down really. It's kind of just stayed around here. Can we go to the next slide? One of the best things that they've been able to do to boost their economy in the private sector is back in 1995, they created the Doha stock market. And over the years, it just got bigger and bigger and more part of the economy to where in 2009, it was put on an international exchange and it was upgraded to have more international investments in the financing part of it. Because whenever you want to have a business in Qatar or any business opportunity, 51% of it has to be controlled by and owned by a Qatari national. So with the opening of the stock market, it invited a lot more foreign money into the economy to get it going. Most of the private businesses in Qatar that are noticeable are financials and some natural gas, but not too much. That's mostly controlled by the state. In fact, it's more than 70% of the total government revenue comes from oil. So the regulations around that are pretty strict and pretty public favoring. The Qatari government has streamlined a lot of its regulations in the past. It's made government it's made businesses a lot easier to form, a lot cheaper to form. However, there's still the initial demand of a nest egg or a seed money. And just that is very difficult to come across, especially if you're an immigrant. You're not able to really fully own a business in Qatar. You have to have a sponsor of sorts in order to be a worker. But there's a lot of economic opportunity in Qatar if you're a natural born citizen. You can see down in the bottom off to the right, the most important numbers I imagine are the ranks out of 141 countries, how they place in relation to everyone else. So you see the burden of government regulation, they're 6th in the world for the ease of government regulation. So it's pretty open, but there's just not a lot of financial opportunity. Next slide. We also see a lot more of these charts. What I like to point out is 8.08, internal labor mobility. It's just not even applicable. It's not even ranked because unless you're a natural born citizen, it's a lot harder to move up. There's a sponsorship system where you have to be sponsored by your employer in order to have a citizenship in Qatar. And if you're ever fired without securing employment right away, you are deported. So that's also for political reasons, I imagine, as well, but we'll get into that later. We can see the general attitudes of the business culture are favorable in Qatar, with low double digits for a lot of the entrepreneurial culture. So they've had a lot of regulations lifted to where the opportunities are there if you have money. Next slide.
Okay, for the next coming slides, we'll be talking about policy and law. Political stability and absence of violence and terrorism is a huge thing, especially in the Middle East. Measures the percentage of likelihood of political instability. Qatar is actually one of the high stable countries in the Middle East, and for the reason is that they're ruled by an emir, which is basically a monarch or a king, and the emir controls every part of the Qatari government. He also controls the Qatari military. The current ruler is Tamimi bin Hamad Al Thani, who was the successor from his father. He's actually the youngest ruler in the MENA region, and the Al Thani family has been ruling Qatar for 140 years and have family members in every high government position in Qatar. So Political stability is there just because it's basically all of them and they rule everything. So you're not going to see any changing of government, whether that's a bad thing or a good thing. It's just very stable. Qatari is very wealthy, a nation backed by the world's third largest natural gas reserves. Also has a bunch of oil reserves. The royal family very much pays off their citizens to stay peaceful. That's why you have a low lack of violence. They pay them in providing healthcare, jobs, education, and housing. And this is only for natural citizens, no foreigners. Terrorism is rarely seen in Qatar, with the last one being in 2005 on a theater. Yet the Qatar government doesn't do a like public job at attacking terrorist organizations because they don't want to anger any of the terrorist organizations within their country. So they just keep it on the down low. But yeah, they're against terrorism, but they don't want to upset any of the terrorist groups. Qatar has many allies in the region due to their financial aid that they provide other Middle Eastern countries, like loans or financial aid or services in military. And so they're able to have a small border, like a buffer border and allies around them, so nothing happens to them. Qatar is known for housing the largest United States air base in the Middle East, and this air base has been used in America's wars in the Middle East as a huge strategic point to like ship weapons and food to the U.S. military. So not only does it have other Middle Eastern countries to protect them, it also has the U.S. Air base protecting them. This is Qatar's leader, the current leader. In 2017, Qatar has been blamed for supporting many anti-government protests in the Middle East. Many opponents of Qatar blame them for the Arab Spring. It supports the rebels in Syria's civil war, rumored to have armed the rebels even. Also participated in the Saudi Arabian intervention in Yemen against the Houthis for the leader. We just talked about Yemen, so they're the ones behind the current civil war in Yemen. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain cut off diplomatic relations with Qatar, citing the country's alleged support of groups they considered to be extremists during the Arab Spring. This one was strange because not only Saudi Arabia did cut ties, but Qatar also aids Saudi Arabia when Saudi Arabia wants to go into intervention. So I couldn't find anything specific, but these are the facts that I found from the website I was looking at. The rule of law is very high. People respect the law in Qatar for many reasons because they take breaking the law very serious in Qatar, and they will enforce it. It's right now, Qatar has a mixture between Sharia law and civil law for many of the small business regulations, but most of the legal registrations go into Sharia law. Criminal homicide rate in Qatar is 2.11 currently. Altogether, not bad compared to a state like New York that has a homicide rate of 3.4. So it's very low for a country. It's very strict when it comes to sexuality and alcohol consumption. When it comes to their citizens, in 2014, a very modest campaign was launched to remind tourists of Qatar's dress code. So they take those kind of small things very seriously, where dress code, sexuality, alcoholism, that's all like very taboo over there. Homosexuality is a crime punishable by death, but has not been carried out in years. But it's still a thing there. Overall, the safety index of Qatar is 88.24, which is the highest in the Middle East, and out of 163 countries, it ranks 31st.
All right. Government effectiveness measures the perceptions of the quality of public services, the quality of the civil services, and the degree of its independence from political pressures. We have a lot of government funding of the public sector in order to keep the voices down, the voices of the masses down and satisfied. So there's a lot of political motivation behind its lavish public sector. And with the government effectiveness, the policies that it's implemented, you can see on the left, the macroeconomic stability is very, very high up there. The square on the bottom of the right of all those are the average numbers for the MENA region. So you can see in every category, it seems to be doing better than the average. So government policy has been successful in its goals. It's currently at the 74.5th percentile, so it does better than 3/4 of the world in this category. Next slide. It's ruled by the House of Thani. It was, we talked about this a little earlier. It's type of constitutional / absolute democracy with the Emir as effectively the king. In 2003, they have ratified a constitution favored by 98% of the population, which calls for a direct election of 30 of the 45 members of the Legislative Council. But this is yet to actually be implemented. 17 years later, we still don't have a proper elected legislative council. But other than that, the government is pretty effective at enacting its policy changes. It doesn't have a lot of political opposition. The people are more or less indifferent to a lot of the policy that they do. They're more inclined to want to change the WASTA system rather than the individual policy changes. They want the big picture change. But they're not too terribly empowered to do it. Those that do have political power are often bought off with their good jobs. You can see down towards the bottom, the indicators down here. They're from the Global Competitiveness Report. So it's not exactly the same thing as the world indicators, the world governance indicators, but they do measure some of the same things that would be included. So when we see the government long-term vision being of some of the best in the world, I do believe that is more true than false. They do have a very effective government. There's not a lot of opposition, really. It just does what it needs to do. And a lot of people, especially the workers, do not benefit by it. But if they don't like it, then by the government's attitude, then they don't need to find employment there. Next slide.
Voice and accountability. This is if the citizens of their country could speak out and for political change. Right now, Qatar doesn't sit very highly because it is a monarchy. But yeah, so freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of media. Right now, both men and women citizens in Qatar are allowed to vote. They just don't really have much influence. It's like dead races, pretty much. Like, or the decision's already decided, but they are allowed to vote. So, flogging is a common form of punishment for alcohol and illicit sexual activities. So there is like real punishment, physical punishment for breaking laws. Freedom of expression is restrictive and heavily surveilled in the name of fighting terrorism. So yeah, they try to silence anyone that wants to speak out in the name of terrorism, something we're all familiar with. And in terms of political corruption, Qatar ranks 32nd out of 179 in the 2000 Political Corruption Index. Like my partner said, they aren't very corrupt in the sense of bribes, just because they control everything. So they don't really need to take bribes or anything like that because they really have an easy job. So there's not really much political corruption in that sense, but it's just an entire monarchy. So they don't have to worry about political corruption. For foreign laborers, this is where things are in question right now. Qatar has become under fire for recent accusation of forced foreign labor, when it comes to forced infrastructure labor for men and forced prostitution for women. Foreign laborers are tricked into signing favorable contracts to come to Qatar, but once they're there, they're forced into a completely different labor contract, and they don't have an option because like they're already there, and they'll be sent to prison if they don't sign the working contract. Ones that pay little to its workers and upcharge them for common utilities like water or bathroom resources and housing and food, and they overcharge these laborers and leave them into debt. They are also take away their passports, so they're not able to escape their enslavement, basically. The most recent example was the building of the FIFA 2022 World Cup buildings, where this was most recently talked about and where it was brought up. They're expected 4,000 laborers to die in the process of building all their stadiums. So yeah, that's very, there's very little voice being heard from foreign laborers once they get there.
As well as high recruitment costs. You have to pay in order to be sponsored. And so there are people thousands of dollars in debt equivalency, and they still have to work in low wage jobs in order to pay off in a massive debt. Another thing, GDP per capita for this country, when you do the purchasing power parity, this country ends up being #1 in the world at like $132,000 per person. But also another fun fact is that 94% of the labor force is foreign workers, and they make up 80% of the population, yet have next to no political power.
So yeah, those are the indicators. And how successful have these measures been to addressing political and economic stability? Well, we know that Qatar is very rich and politically stable, but these measures meant, especially for a monarchy, is very like in question whether they mean much at all, if anything. So, but yeah, if you're just looking at the measurements themselves, Qatar is very high when it comes to their own citizens and their own laws and political people. Any questions?
Well, I guess not. Well, thank you very much. And
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Who's next?
No, that's it. We're gonna finish right there. We don't have much time. We only have 8 minutes, so I guess we're gonna stop right there. Unless anyone has any questions. If not, then we will continue next time with the next group, Group 6. Jonah Mendoza, Chelsea Bazan, and Brett Jordan. Those are the ones that will be starting the next presentation on Thursday. And I guess that's about it. If anyone has any questions. Any questions from anyone? Doesn't have to be regarding the presentation, but anything else that you may have in mind.
Professor, how do these, like, when are we going to be taking the next test, or like when we close out the lessons?
We're gonna have the first midterm exam. I guess once we finish chapter 4. So we're getting very close to it. And
Okay.
we're gonna be taking the exam again, of course, online through Titanium. You'll just be uploading your answers by using either Word doc or PDF and submitting your answers, basically. You have about an hour for the exam, maybe, I don't know, probably there will be 3 questions out of 4 that you need to answer. And they're all short answer questions. So, well, we will talk about the midterm exam when we get close to it. We will talk about the type of questions you need to focus on.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
The rough draft of the term paper is due next week.
I guess you need to go to the instructions and find out. I forgot. I don't remember the dates, but they should be in the
It's on
instructions.
September 22nd.
22nd, September 22nd. Okay.
Okay.
So just make sure you submit your draft again through Titanium. And I will be able to give you feedbacks. Use those feedbacks to rewrite your final version. But you will be graded. So make sure that you do your best in the first version because that will be graded. And the second version will add 10 percentage points max. So you could come up with only 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 10 percentage points more. You will see an improvement to your grade. If you incorporate all the points that I've recommended or suggested for you in the feedbacks. Any other questions? Okay, so yeah, the presentations were pretty good. I mean, you know, I'm really happy with the work that you all have done. All of you, probably, you know, I have the scores here, but all of you did pretty well. All of you are in the A range, so it seems like all of you have done an excellent job in the presentation. So keep it up, and that's all I'm going to say right now. Okay. So I'll see you then on Thursday. Take care now.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor. Good night.
Night.